Okay, so what we're going to look at here is about friction. Yes, I'm showing you sports footwear. If we notice here, with a soccer shoe or baseball shoe or whatever that may be, compared to a basketball shoe, something that you can quickly see is that the bottoms are vastly different. All right. The basketball shoes are flat, a lot of ridging underneath to create more friction. Um, Whereas with the soccer shoe or football or whatever this shoe has cleats. They're meant to dig in to create more friction with the ground. Now, sometimes we've uh, I've been wearing running shoes and tried to go play soccer, and there's not a lot of grip there. Whenever I try to turn quickly, there's less friction. But if I were wearing cleated shoes, the grip would be there because these studs, is what they're called, grip into the ground. So we can see where friction is actually being prioritized with our footwear. Um, there's a stark contrast for both of these shoes. If I were to wear, with the reverse of this, if I were to wear soccer shoes to go play basketball, I would slip all around because the surface area touching the court would only be these cleats, which isn't enough to generate enough friction for me to move around as easily as I would like. Friction is hugely important. It is a force. Uh, it's one of the two main forces, which the other is gravity. Yeah, we see with how we design things, and if you really want to look at it, go check out the tires on an automobile. Um, Tires are created to put as much friction between the car and the road as possible without slowing it down. Grip is extremely important. So when comparing things, in this case, we're just comparing shoes. You see how both offer great friction for the sport they play or the surface you play on. But it's not interchangeable because soccer shoes would not be great for basketball, and basketball shoes are not great for soccer. You lose friction based upon the surface. Going to surfaces, which is really, really something I want to focus on. The top one is an ice rink, and the other one is a basketball court. Um, think about what you need in order to to have good mobility on ice, and not just good mobility, but just controlled. You have to wear ice skates, and there are blades on the bottom that dig into the ice to create that friction. If I were to use basketball or soccer shoes on this ice, uh, neither would be effective enough because neither would be able to dig into the ice to where there's control. Ice skates will give you the best amount of friction, whereas cleats and basketball shoes will offer very little friction. Therefore, you slide all over the place. Friction is extremely important. Think about this. If friction did not exist, we would be standing, maybe not standing, but we will be stuck in the same place our entire lives. Um, so let's be very thankful for friction. Friction is also what slows us down once a force, or if we're not generating any forces um, to keep us going. And that kind of brings us to my next point here. I have three surfaces. I have a grass field, a basketball court, and an ice rink. And think about this. If I were to take a rock and just, use the same amount of force on each of these three subjects while I'm throwing it, which one do you think the rock would travel furthest on? You know, um, and to reverse the question, which surface would the rock travel the least amount of distance on? Essentially, what it comes down to is, if I threw a rock on the grass field, it wouldn't bounce very many times because there's too much friction. The grass creates that friction there, not allowing the rock's inertia to keep it going. Whereas with the basketball court, yeah, it would bounce. It would travel further if I'm using the same amount of force. That's I'm not changing the amount of force I'm putting on the rock, but there's less friction with this basketball court. Perhaps if I used a rubber ball or a rubber rock, there would be a little bit more friction involved with it, and it wouldn't travel nearly as far. But if this was just a regular rock, we'll say 100 grams, it would it would bounce off the floor, but eventually once it's done bouncing, it will slide for an amount of distance that it wouldn't on the grass surface, because it lacks that much, or it lacks less friction. Now, if I were to throw the same rock on the ice, yes, it would bounce around a little bit, but after it was done bouncing, it would continue to slide because there's a lot less friction between the rock and the ice. It's slippery. Think about that. If you've ever been outside, think about recently where it's iced here. You step on ice, you slip, you fall. It hurts, right? Because there's less friction there. If you ever see mountain climbers, they've got these spikes all over their shoes when they're trying to make it up to the summit. They're trying to create more friction because it's really hard to create friction with ice. Think about hockey players or ice skaters, and how strange like ice skates would be, like if we wore them, around town. They only make sense on ice because it's that slippery. It has less friction. So I found that to be, good points of thought, when it comes to surfaces. So kind of to reiterate, an object will travel less distance on grass because of more friction, a little bit more on a basketball court because it's flat, there's not as much friction, and a lot more in compared to the grass on an ice surface because there is far less friction. And in some cases, like think of a slip and slide where less friction, it becomes fun, right? But you apply that into a car sliding on ice on the road, it loses its fun. It's like, I want more friction, right? And that's one reason why people in the wintertime deflate their tires a little bit, kind of making them flattish, but not completely flat, because the flatter the tire is, the more surface area, more contact with the road, and which creates more friction. And if you want to think about it this way, it's kind of like, wearing soccer shoes on a basketball court. There's a lot less friction because there's a lot less surface area touching the actual court itself. Whereas on grass, these cleats dig in and the bottom of the sole actually comes in contact with the ground, making it more accessible with that type of surface.